Slavery, like patriarchy or like hierarchy, is actually a very recent phenomenon. Slavery, patriarchy, other forms of hierarchical domination in society are not that old. The first forms of human slavery go back to ancient Sumer, toward the very beginnings of civilization. Now, when I say civilization, I mean something very specific. I mean agricultural society, which began 10,000 years ago. And for millions of years before that period, all of our history as humans and all of our human ancestors lived in small hunting-gathering bands. But one of the most radical changes to ever happen in human history happened just 10,000 years ago when we began to settle in one location and began to farm and to domesticate the wild plants and animals. 10,000 years ago, that's all. Before then, no patriarchy. Before then, no hierarchical domination. Before then, equality within society, basic harmony with nature. So, actually, the first form of slavery was the enslavement of animals. That began with agricultural society. Because again, agricultural society means the domestication of the wild, the domestication of plants. We cultivate plants. The domestication of animals. We start to breed animals. We start to keep animals and to exploit them for our use. It's the beginning of a process that culminates today with genetic engineering, whereby we take the wild and we colonize it and we change it technologically and exploit it for our purposes. So, for instance, we began to use animals for food, for transportation, and for labor. We brought them into our societies. They no longer ran free or wild. We confined them. We branded them. We castrated them. We controlled these animals and exploited them in any number of ways. And now this is a very important point that very few people understand. Racism, sexism, ableism, and many forms of human hierarchy have their origins in speciesism. And of course, by speciesism, I mean the philosophy that we are radically unique from all other animals, that in fact we are not even an animal, we are superior to them, and they exist for our purposes, and we can do what we wish with them. When you ask the question, who is the human being? Who is Homo sapiens? What's the answer? Rational man. Rational man. In other words, we deny rationality to animals, we deny our own animality, and we establish ourselves as a pure rational essence, a mind without a body almost, as Descartes later said. Now, that means that if the human is the rational, any form of human, any type of human group, women, people of color, islanders, the disabled, etc., if they are thought to be less than rational, they are said to be less than human. They are closer to animals than to humans. So we call them subhumans. And every time we go to war with another nation, we always reduce people to animals. They are rats, they are dogs, they are monkeys, they are vermin. Always they have to be dehumanized, and then they are easy to kill. Because we already have speciesism as the foundation of our conceptual thought thinking and of our society, of our civilization. So we've created this box, animals, no reason, no moral status. And we can take any people, drag them into that box by saying they have no rationality, therefore they have no rights. So I'm saying that if you believe in human rights, you better believe in animal rights, because you will never get human rights without animal rights, and vice versa. If you want to abolish sexism, if you want to abolish racism, you must understand these philosophies came from speciesism. So when civilization came about and we domesticated animals and we defined ourselves in sharp opposition to them as rational beings, we treated women like animals. We treated slaves who were captured from warfare like animals. They were not full members of society. We bred them like animals. They were considered to be resources for breeding, for exploitation, just like animals. Now, all the technologies that were used to enslave human beings in the modern international slave trade, chains, whips, cages, auctions, branding, all of these things were first done to animals. And the first philosopher of slavery was Aristotle. Aristotle created a hierarchy of value in the universe. It was a scale of perfection, and the more rationality a being had, the more perfect that being was. So God was at the top of the hierarchy, humans were not far below, and women and slaves were toward the bottom, and animals were at the very bottom. And to quote Aristotle, just as plants exist for animals, so animals exist for humans. So lower forms of life serve the purpose for higher forms of life. Slavery was a natural and just fact of the universe. There was nothing wrong about it. It was natural. And thus you have the beginnings of Western thought. Western thought is grounded not 2,500 years ago, but in the beginnings of agricultural society, and that's rooted in speciesism and the domestication of animals. So now, jump ahead to the 15th century when the international slave trade begins with Henry the Navigator in the early 15th century taking slaves from Africa to Portugal, and then of course Columbus, 1492, taking slaves from Africa and various islands to Spain and other European nations. In the United States, slavery had reached its height. Millions of slaves taken from Africa across the dreaded Middle Passage, and they went to the absolute worst country you could go to be a slave. And just like we did with animals, we shipped them, we chained them, we beat them, we auctioned them, we branded them, we broke up families, and we sent them off for slave labor for their owners. Now, actually, what I'm saying so far is very controversial. And what I want to do is define what a slave is and respond to two objections to using the word slavery to apply to animals. So I'm saying animals are slaves, they can be slaves, they are the oldest, it is the oldest form of slavery, and it is the most prevalent, dominant, bloodiest, barbaric form of slavery ever invented, and it continues and it is escalating. So what, you have to have two legs to be a slave? No. A slave is any being, any sentient being who knows the difference between pleasure and pain and between freedom and domination. A slave is any being held captive against its will. A slave is forced to labor for another. This slave is the property of this other, and this other is the owner of the slave. The owner has legal rights, including the right of life and death over the slave. So a slave is any sentient being, human or non-being, with its will denied, its freedom denied, its basic instinct to be free denied to it. Its natural life instincts are thwarted, controlled, and blocked. It is a subject, the subject of a life, reduced to an object, to a mere resource, thing, and commodity. And it is violated and perverted in every facet of its life. Now let me give you some examples of how animals are slaves, and I think you'll start to get a clear idea of what I mean by animal slavery. Consider a few different cases. 1. Circuses, zoos, rodeos, and aquariums. In every case, they're held captive against their will. They're taken from the wild. They're taken from their families. They are forced to labor, which we call performance. In a zoo, your performance is just to be there, but you're performing for an audience. For instance, in an aquarium, why do you think orca whales kill their trainers? They're confined in a small artificial tank. They are compelled to perform labor up to 6 or 8 shows a day before a bunch of screaming idiots. Thank you. Thank you. Let's hear it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Molto grazie. Consider another case. Oxes, horses, and mules, or horse carriages, an issue here recently in Italy. They're held captive, they're owned, they're forced to do labor. They're enslaved in every sense of the word. 2 more examples, slightly more subtle or complex. Farmed animals. Think of a chicken in a cage, in a battery cage. Think of a dairy cow tied to a machine, a milk machine. They're held captive, they're owned, their property. What is their labor? They're forced to produce what? Forced to produce eggs. Forced to produce milk. Eggs, will they do forced molting to make them produce more eggs than naturally they will? Cows are pumped full of genetically modified growth steroid hormones to produce far more milk than they normally would. That is their labor. Okay? They are slaves.